So thank you all for joining us this morning. We have really a terrific panel of journalists here, a very rare occasion that you get a chance to really hear from and question folks who are on the front line in breaking a lot of the major stories that we've all been reading here over the last 8 months or so. So I'll just quickly introduce everyone, and then we will get to some questions, and I'm going to leave some ample time today for Q&A from you folks, because we really want to hear your questions and your chance to, as I say, get access to these really first-class journalists. So just to my right, Vera Bergengruen. Vera is a national security correspondent for BuzzFeed News in Washington, D.C. Before that, she covered the Pentagon, the White House, and the 2016 election as a national correspondent for McClatchy newspapers. While at McClatchy, she was one of the very dogged Michael Flynn investigators, revealing how he had been paid more than $500,000 as a foreign agent for Turkey, and then he stopped a U.S. military plan that Turkey had actually opposed. She also showed how the Trump administration had ignored repeated warnings about Flynn's activities as a paid foreign lobbyist, allowing Flynn to attend classified security briefings during the campaign, and then as Trump's national security advisor. Earlier in her career, she worked on McClatchy's Pulitzer Prize-winning Panama Papers investigation team in partnership with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, reporting on what the 11 million leaked records revealed about Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and several Latin American leaders. Next, Stephen Engelberg. Steve is the editor-in-chief of ProPublica, which under his leadership has earned 4 Pulitzer Prizes, 3 Peabody Awards, 2 Emmy Awards, 5 George Polk Awards, 3 online journalism awards, a National Magazine Award, and a partridge in a pear tree.
Anything else?
Prior to ProPublica, he was the managing editor at the Portland Oregonian, and before joining the Oregonian, he worked for the New York Times for 18 years, including stints in Washington, D.C. and Warsaw, as well as in New York. He is a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board and of the Board of Directors of the American Society of News Editors. Then we have Michael S. Schmidt. Michael really ranks among the most versatile investigative reporters working today. He started at the Times, the New York Times, a decade ago, soon distinguishing himself by breaking stories about baseball players who had tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs, including David Ortiz, Manny Ramirez, and, as a Cubs fan, sad to say, Sammy Sosa. In 2015, this man broke the story about Hillary Clinton's use of a private email account while serving as Secretary of State, a revelation that haunted her throughout the presidential campaign. And as you probably know, with her new book out, she pretty much holds Michael and the New York Times accountable for costing her the presidency, fair or not. Then, when he was finished with Hillary Clinton, he turned his spotlight to Donald Trump, breaking stories about the FBI's investigation into links between Trump's campaign in Russia, Trump's loyalty demand to then FBI Director James Comey, and his request that Comey shut down the investigation into Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. That story pretty much led to the Justice Department appointing Robert Mueller as the special counsel to investigate. Along the way, Schmidt and another reporter for the Times broke the story that led to Bill O'Reilly leaving Fox News. But even all of those revelations were not enough to satisfy this man's insatiable curiosity. Last week, he broke a world exclusive that revealed how the Boston Red Sox have been using Apple Watches to steal secret hand signals flashed between catchers and pitchers from opposing teams, especially the New York Yankees. So far, no evidence has surfaced that the Red Sox used private emails or employed clandestine Russian bat boys, but stay tuned. Matthew Rosenberg, at the end of our panel here, is also an award-winning journalist who covers national security for the New York Times. After serving as a distinguished foreign correspondent for the Associated Press and the Wall Street Journal, Rosenberg joined the Times in 2011. He was famously expelled from Afghanistan in August 2014 on the orders of President Hamid Karzai after he revealed that the CIA had been delivering bags of cash to the Afghan president's office for more than a decade to finance a slush fund. Most recently, Rosenberg has been one of the main reporters at the paper covering the investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. Among other major scoops, he was the reporter who discovered Trump had revealed highly classified intelligence to Russia and that U.S. intelligence had intercepted communications showing how the Russians were plotting to exert influence over Trump through his advisors. So, gives you some idea of who you have sitting here, and we have flashing on the screen here a sampling of all of their recent headlines. So let's dive in with some questions. And Michael, I'd like to ask the first question to you. What's different today versus the Watergate era of investigative reporting? Is it actually easier to do investigative reporting about the Trump White House, given the extraordinary factionalization, incessant leaking, and hostility between Trump and the intelligence services? Okay, it's like a movie theater. You got to mute your phones before the movie starts. Is investigative reporting in Washington today kind of like fishing with dynamite? You just sit on the dock and wait for stuff to fall in your lap.
I think that folks think that what we do is perhaps a little more cut and dry and easier than it looks. I think there's some notion out there that the phone ring, we sit at our desks, the phone rings, there's some dark, deep voice.
Bannon here.
Yeah. He's now speaking publicly a lot, if you can't tell. And they give it to us and we just, thanks a lot, and you type it up and you put it online. It's incredibly more complex and difficult than that. While it does look like there are a lot of leaks that are coming out because there's so much information in the press, I think that is probably more a function of two other things. One is that we are out there in a way that we've never been before, asking questions and pushing on doors. And that the more that we do that, it's like a numbers game, the more information that we're going to get. The other thing is that people are motivated in a way that at least I have never seen before to speak. They know the ramifications of what they're saying, but they are more likely to give us information. What makes all this really hard is that all of the really, really great information here is classified. So it makes the whole process much more difficult. Someone's calling with a story, maybe. It makes what makes it really particularly difficult are two things. One is that the stuff is classified, and people who divulge it to us, give us that information, could go to prison. And the other thing is that it's highly competitive. Every organization has several people dedicated to this story. They're out there like we are trying to get things, and that makes fighting for it really, really tough.
So let me flip that question around a little bit and Matt, ask you, last week USA Today published an investigation that tracked how dozens of wealthy lobbyists and contractors were collectively spending millions of dollars on memberships to Trump's golf clubs to gain close access to Trump himself. Recently, Walter Schaub, who recently resigned as the director of the Office of Government Ethics after repeated clashes with the White House, he was quoted as saying, "I think we're all in new territory. We never thought we'd see anyone push the outer limits in this way." So, is Schaub correct? Is there just so much to investigate now that Trump is simply overwhelming the limits of existing laws and overloading the media's circuits and your ability even to cover all of this stuff?
I think there's some truth to that. First of all, if you're a lobbyist, of course you're getting a membership. That's probably the first on your to-do list, is sign up and let's get the president some money. Look, I spent a long time in Afghanistan and in parts of Africa where the people in power use their positions while in power to enrich themselves. It's It's incredibly dangerous. You see the detrimental effects it has in societies. And I don't think we're necessarily built to cover that. The same way we weren't built to cover, say, the invasion of Iraq, to pull people in from everywhere, because that's not something that's ever really gone on in recent American history, at least. I think. Oh, sorry. It's not something that's really gone on in recent American history where the person in power has been running a business, and that business has been benefiting from their role. I think in Washington and elsewhere, there was kind of an understood formula. You're in public service, afterward go cash in, but don't do it while you're actually in office. And, I think, first of all, newspapers structurally, or news organizations, have different departments. There's the business desk, they cover business. There's Washington covers Washington, foreign covers foreign. And here you have a great mixing where, we have a real estate reporter who knows a lot about Trump and a lot about his dealings. We know a lot about questions about his dealings, but, you've got to get all those pieces together. And I think we're still in that process of trying to bring in everyone who can look at this. And we've got a lot of people working on this. Also, Trump runs a kind of confusing, sprawling business empire. It just takes a lot of people to look at stuff. And there's a lot there that probably isn't wrong. But you got to kind of flesh out each piece. You've got, as Mike pointed out, nobody's just calling with a tip. It takes a lot of work. And I'm not entirely sure when this started that we were built for this and staffed up for it. I think that's a process that's still going on.
So, Stephen, on a related note, your organization has really distinguished itself in exposing a lot of details about how Trump can continue to profit, or is continuing to profit, from his businesses while he's in office, and also this extraordinary hiring of lobbyists to work at the agencies where they once lobbied. Yet, I think you could argue that the political impact of these revelations so far has been pretty negligible. Just last week, the House Republicans shut down an attempt to force the Treasury Department to reveal Trump's tax returns. So is this discouraging to you that your reporting, that your all the efforts of your teams seems to be really not having a lot of effect?
Well, I think it depends what you define as effect, right? I personally believe at the moment, and it's actually a running thing within our office, I work with a guy who runs our business side, and he and I have a standing bet. I believe Donald Trump will serve 4 years. I actually do. I don't think we're going to see, the 25th Amendment, is it? The impeachment. I think these things are all very unlikely events. I should add, so is his election, so who knows? Don't ask me to predict the future, but let's assume we're going to have 4 years. I think there's a lot of reporting to be done, and I think what we're trying to do is lay the groundwork. The first thing is to identify who the personnel are who are in these positions. The more important question, and believe me, we're watching, is, as is the New York Times, we're actually working with the New York Times on some of these things as a joint collaboration, is what are they going to do? What is the Scott Pruitt EPA going to do? The new head of coal mine safety is, I guess, a guy who's very linked to reducing coal mine safety. So what's going to happen? When they reduce all the inspections, who's going to get injured? What's going to happen when OSHA no longer does anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So I think we're very early days. And, I also think it's worth remembering the size of the Trump base is by no means the majority of Americans, and all the polling data indicates that the number of people who voted for him during the election and the number of people who continue to support him today has been, by all this stuff, significantly diminished. So we'll see.
So,
as somebody else likes to say.
Yes. So, Vera, once upon a time, investigatory revelations about a presidential candidate who ran his businesses into bankruptcy, stiffed contractors, engaged in charitable self-dealing, repeatedly made sexist and misogynist statements, that would have been disqualifying for a presidential candidate in the past. Yet Trump seems to have proven that facts no longer matter to voters. What do you think the implications of this are for journalists like yourself and for our democracy?
Well, I think it's just, there's an avalanche of information. As Matt pointed out, it's a very complicated story. All of these different investigations, different comments. It seems like one thing comes out that's very shocking, and then the next one bowls it over, and we're trying to cover it all. And I think what happens is a lot of people kind of retreat into their own bubbles because it's too complicated. It's too hard to keep track of everything. And so, Democrats or liberals, many of them will say, Putin's calling Trump every night. That's what they believe. Every little thing that comes out about the investigation is immediately a very shady thing. When I talk to supporters of the president or to Republicans, much of the time, you confront them with things that are coming out, and they say, well, that's not illegal, technically. Technically, that's not illegal. That's what they retreat to. And so
that was always the standard for Obama, by the way.
Right. So there's a lot of that happening, and I think it's difficult for us in a way to, as Michael said yesterday, condense this into an 800-word story with all of the context that it deserves, and laying out the facts, because just laying out the facts also, in a way, everyone can twist it into what they want. And I do think it's very complicated for us to try to lay it out in a way that that places it in gives it the proper weight to what is happening about every single thing. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of covering this very slow-moving investigation, where it seems like every week there's a little other piece that is revealed, and we're trying to place it in context for people without blowing it out of proportion or saying that it doesn't matter. So,
you were talking last night to our audience about your experience in covering the run-up to the election, and then after the results of the election were known, you went back out and talked to voters. Tell people here, what did you find, and was that surprising to you?
Well, I particularly was going back a lot to certain places that had voted heavily for Trump and asking them, do you care that he's not doing what he said he would do? And specifically, I was focusing on, the whole drain the swamp promise, and during the transition, when he was apparently just allowing the whole swamp to come in, and things like that, and overwhelmingly people said they didn't care, and they said that they, one of the quotes was, if it's better than Hillary's swamp. He's going to make the swamp work for us, And so I think I haven't gone back in a while to do that, but I think it's interesting to see whether if his base or if his supporters don't see that happening, if all of these payoffs in terms of having business as usual, of having enormous special interests controlling a lot of things that he said weren't going to do that, if they are not doing what he said he was going to do, whether they're going to hold him accountable for that. Because I still see a lot of hope that at least he's using the same people, but to make them work for what he said he would do for us.
So was it surprising to any of you that during the Obamacare debate and the efforts to repeal Obamacare, that I kept reading all these stories that said that voters in the heartland, people who had supported him, where somehow the light bulbs were now going off, and they realized, hey, wait a minute, maybe this wouldn't be such a good thing if they take away Obamacare. Was it surprising to you that the voters, some voters at least, some Trump supporters were having some of the scales falling from their eyes? Anyone?
Sure. I mean, I think that was. Why not? I think that was actually, from the perspective of journalism and facts, a very hopeful moment, because, the plan as it was laid out pretty clearly in all the reporting was what Donald Trump himself later described as mean. I think actually McCain did his colleagues on the Senate Republican side an enormous favor by being the one vote to knock it down, because I think they had all come to the conclusion that that bill as it stood could not pass without them being dealt a very severe blow. So for all those people who are saying, well, there's no fact-based journalism, nobody cares what anybody says, I thought that was actually a moment where, if you present clearly what the substance of something is, people do pay attention. And remember, during the campaign, what Trump had said was, I'm going to make a better health care system. It's going to be even better than Obamacare. Everybody's going to be covered, and they're going to feel, and the premiums are going to drop. And when the CBO came along and said, actually, none of the above, people didn't say, well, I believe in my president, I don't care what the CBO says. They said, wow, that sounds terrible. So I found that a hopeful moment in our democracy.
So, Matt, something like 89, in a recent poll, something like 89% of Democrats said they believed that they believed in the importance of the media's watchdog role. But only 42% of Republicans do. So half as many Republicans as Democrats actually trust the media as watchdogs. This is according to the Pew Research Center. It's the widest gap that Pew has ever seen. Yet less than 2 years ago, according to Pew, Democrats and Republicans essentially agreed on the role of the press, with Republicans actually outpacing Democrats in their support. So let's talk about Trump's relentless cries of fake news. Are they having their intended effect? has the legitimate media been so sullied and the public become so confused and cynical that news will forevermore be viewed through a partisan lens?
Well, I think the first thing to point out is that 2 years ago, people like Michael were writing about Hillary Clinton emails. So Republicans, they were getting what they wanted out of the press, a watchdog role that they saw as useful, and now they're man as president, and they don't like the watchdog role so much. And I think that's a little natural. I don't want to blame the cynicism of some Americans entirely on Donald Trump. I think it was there well before Trump. In fact, Trump seems much more like a symptom, and a lot of features of our politics seem like a symptom than the actual disease. I don't think it's been so sullied that this is going to be unrecoverable. I don't know what the word is. I do think that one of the things that Trump has accelerated, especially in the mainstream media, is that for a long time, for decades, we kind of behaved with a detachment. Our stories will speak for themselves. We're going to write as if we're writing in this kind of vacuum, in a sense, and what we're saying is what people should worry about. We're not going to worry about what other people are saying. And that was probably fine in an America that was very deferential to institutions, but that America started fading in the late 60s, and it was long past the point for us to start engaging also with our critics. And we've become, especially in the last 7-8 months, much better at that. Where, let's say you write a story, somebody in the right or left completely misconstrues it and makes well, they said X, and now this becomes something that's part of the national conversation, where we will go out and address that, where when the president gets up and says the New York Times is failing and they apologize to their readers after my election, well, our executive editor will put out statements saying, A, subscribership has gone up, and B, we did not apologize. And that's a good thing, I think. That signals to readers and to people who might be readers that we actually care about what they think of us and what they have to say as well, and that interplay is incredibly important.
But there's also two large megaphones that have a big impact on us, and the first being the president, who has used the media as an thing to attack, to build himself up, and he constantly will attack the media whenever he feels boxed in. And whether those criticisms are valid or not, his megaphone trickles down, and it does have an impact, at least on some people. And the second thing is Fox News, which for many years now, for almost 2 decades now, has been blaring commentary about the mainstream media that is incredibly critical. Whether it's true or not, there's an enormous amount of people that watch that and take that in. So those are two big factors. And actually the third being conservative talk radio, which is similar to Fox News. So there's a lot of noise out there that's been going on for at least 2 decades now that has undermined us, and it's not something I think we've completely figured out how to respond to.
So have either of you changed the way that you approach stories and the way that you report and write stories in the last couple of years in response to this new environment into which your stories are being injected?
Well, Matt and I had an incident earlier this year where we were being attacked for a story that we had been written by the far right. And we actually had a disagreement about how to respond to it. You want to explain?
The story was ran right before the inauguration about how the FBI was actually investigating Trump. There was this investigation into Trump and Trump associates, not Trump personally. And in the headline it said wiretap. And in the story it mentioned kind of intercepted communications. And I think what we weren't clear on in that story, and what we were still learning ourselves, and we're very, very clear on now, is that those were intercepts of, say, American intelligence listening to Russians or others and picking up either Americans talking on those calls or other things, that Trump himself, his people directly, were not under surveillance. But after Trump in early March, sort of tweeted, the Obama administration tapped Trump Tower, within a few days, looking for like a post facto justification, you had all these kind of very right-wing commentators saying, well, the Times reported this in January. We got this from them. This isn't Donald Trump making anything up. And so we were invited on a TV show to kind of push back on this with a CNN commentator named Jeffrey Lord, very right-wing.
We were taking a lot of criticism, and we were being used. They were saying the Times is now raising questions about what Trump is saying, when in January they said exactly what he indeed is claiming. And what we had to do was figure out how to respond to it. And my first response was, let's not engage with these people. This is info wars. These are conspiracy theorists that are misconstruing what we're doing. If we go out there and push back and respond to it, then we're just going to elevate them and just make it a bigger thing. But Matt had a different perspective.
And I was saying, look, this is already out there. When it's getting on CNN and elsewhere, it's beyond InfoWars, and we got to get out there and we push back on it. In that case, we did push back on it. I think it went well because they started looking for other justifications for Trump's tweets, and it did kind of shut down that story. But Michael and I were talking about that this morning, and this whole problem is that we all at the paper have to spend a lot more time than we used to thinking about, well, what do we push back on, what do we don't? Because there are moments where you would just be feeding a fire, where it is just the fringe, there's no sense in going out publicly, you will then make it a bigger story than it is. Then there are moments where you absolutely should be pushing back. Figuring that out actually takes bandwidth, takes effort, takes time, and then going out and doing the actual pushback takes time, and that takes time away from actual journalism, from running a business that we'd all like to be more profitable than it is, I guess, for the business side. That's a new feature, I think, that you certainly have really seen develop in the last 7, 8, 9 months, where it's become so loud, and you've got to find ways or take the time to think, what do we push back on, what do we not push back on, and how do we do it?
But as a leader of a news organization, do you approach it differently, or how do you see it now?
I see it very much where Matthew is. We do at ProPublica a lot of pretty sophisticated data analysis, and I have told the reporters that do that, here's how you budget your time. It's going to take you X amount of time to do the story, to write the story, to edit the story, and then you can add 20% on top of that to explain and defend your work. Because that's the way it goes. And it turns out, even in something as seemingly arcane as data and journalism, there are various wings, and people, when you publish something, write blog posts and tweets and the rest of it that say, you've got it completely wrong, you don't know which end of the number sign is up, and it's all false. And if you don't write and respond to that in detail and specifically, I think you leave people saying, well, who knows who's right? And so I actually think at this point in the history of journalism, when people say things and characterize your work incorrectly, you have to do it, and I believe you have to do it proactively. We've even responded to people who didn't write to us. I mean, people who publish things completely in other places, and we've said, there are people out there in the universe who think we're completely wrong. Well, here's what we have to say to that. And so I'm a great believer, and I've been sort of pushing this to my colleagues, editors of newspapers and other publications, whether you like it or not. This is now, as they say in The Godfather, this is the life we chose. Sorry, but we now have the lack of barriers to entry, the ability of any man or woman to publish something is a great thing. It allows Vera and myself to work for organizations that don't have a single piece of printed paper and have much lower cost structures than you do. That's a great thing. It also means anybody else can push back on us. So I think explaining yourself and when necessary defending your work, that's what journalism includes now. I think we're just there.
Right, and something we also touched on last night is cutting this off before it starts. It's kind of, we already know at this point a lot about how this administration will take certain things, how they will grab onto certain things, and people on either side of the political spectrum, and it's become a little more predictable, and so sometimes I will phrase something a certain way, and Matt and I look at each other, and we know that that's gonna, even though it's accurate, it's just that's not the best way to phrase it, because somebody's going to grab onto that and then twist it out of proportion. And so a lot of it is sharpening it and making it as accurate and kind of dry sometimes as possible, not adding adjectives, not adding certain descriptors, because you can already kind of see into the future on how that's going to play out depending on how important the story is. And sometimes it's stories that aren't important at all and are completely, suddenly you see them on TV claiming something that you never really said. And so I think a lot of it is just being more careful in how we present the information that we report.
One difference today is that I can tell you right now, and I'm pretty sure all of us can, that are sitting on the stage, what anyone is saying about us because of Twitter. Whether I said something mildly controversial on television, whether I look like I was falling asleep on television, whether I misspelled something in my story, or they hate everything I've ever done, we can see that very quickly right now. And it gives you an in-time sort of knowledge of all of the criticisms that are out there about you. And you really have to pick which ones are you going to respond to and which ones are you going to ignore.
That was actually going to be the question I was going to ask, which is with Twitter particularly, how do you avoid the temptation to reply to, these ad hominem attacks or, legitimate attacks? I mean, how do you, because once you dive into that, you might never reemerge.
Well, I mean, mostly you just got other stuff to do, because you really could just spend all day replying to even reasonable people on Twitter.
Right.
And your families, you've worked, you want to go to the gym, you want to eat, so it's pretty easy to say, well, I'm not going to respond to this. But there is, and I think you've seen a number of reporters go wrong on this, a temptation when you try and get back at something that wasn't horrible, and then it just escalates, and next thing you know, you're writing things that are totally inappropriate. So you should have some good friends or colleagues, and you should say, hey, should I tweet this? That's usually pretty helpful. But also just remember that, look, if you're angry or upset, don't do it. It's
usually when you have to ask, it's usually a bad idea.
Almost always.
So you take the same approach that Trump does. You ask, first before you tweet.
Try and read it over, make sure there are no mistakes in it, things like that.
So, Michael, what about this accusation that Hillary Clinton has made that the Times covered her email saga obsessively while playing down evidence of links between the Trump campaign and Russia? That that her accusation that she was held to this different, higher standard than Donald Trump was during the campaign.
So when I wrote the original email story in March of 2015, I obviously didn't know the impact it would have. I thought it was significant. I thought it may be around for a few weeks. But about a month into it, it was clear that it was still around, and I had gone home for Passover, and my mother was there, and my mother looks at me.
Did you mention that your mom is here today?
Yeah, my mother's here. I'm not going to point her out, but she's here. And she looks at me and she says, "When Jeb Bush is president, we'll have you to blame." So I knew early on that this story was going to have a certain life to its own, and people were going to look at it in different ways. The thing is that I'm not into politics. We're into following the facts. It was a story that raised questions about the decisions that she had made, whether she had violated State Department protocol, and then it turned into an FBI investigation. And the idea that we were going to turn away from an ongoing FBI investigation into a presidential candidate was something certainly that we weren't going to do. And sometimes we write things that people don't like. A lot of people that support Donald Trump really like that story and don't like things that I'm writing now. I get it. It comes with the territory. It's something, it's the life that we've chosen, and it's something, we have to deal with the criticisms of. There's also been criticisms of how much we covered what Comey did at the end of October. What Comey did in the final 10 days of the election was completely unprecedented, and was something that we and everyone covered immensely because it was unusual and it was different and it went against the guidelines. And we thought that, look, this is a big thing, we have to cover it. People aren't going to like everything that we write, and that's part of it's part of what we do. Without fear or favor, we follow the facts, and that's hard sometimes for people to understand and to get their head around. But that's sort of how we approach things.
So, Steve, along a similar vein, the conservatives often allege that the quote-unquote liberal media has this agenda and that it's targeting its investigative projects against Republicans and specifically Donald Trump now. So my question to you is the media in some way being unfair to Trump, collectively focusing so many resources on trying to unearth these scandals and wrongdoing? Are Trump supporters correct that the president is enduring some kind of special scrutiny because so many in the mainstream establishment media personally dislike him?
Well, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I can give you the boilerplate answer, which is don't be ridiculous, and there's a lot of truth in the boilerplate answer. You know, when we had 8 years of Obama, and by and large, the work of my organization and indeed the New York Times and BuzzFeed, when we do investigative reporting, is to look at major institutions and find shortcomings in them, right? So we wrote a lot about things the Obama administration did that were dumb or stupid, and and annoyed a lot of people inside the government. And so first of all, it is the nature of journalism, investigative journalism, to look at major companies, the Congress, the White House, the administrative bodies, regulatory agencies, and we don't write stories about planes that crash, that don't crash. We write about the plane crash. Most planes every year land, thank goodness. So that's the boilerplate answer. I do think that subconsciously journalists are people, and if a guy is screaming at you every day that you're the enemy of the state and the enemy of the people, does it have some kind of subliminal effect on how you come to work in the morning? Probably so. I mean, as an editor, I try to make sure that's not true. I try to be very careful, but I think I would be telling you something, although I don't know how many reporters are in the room. The guy that always screams at you on the phone may not always get a break, all right? I mean, people who are really nasty to you, maybe you play it by the book, and maybe somebody who's been really decent for many years gets a little bit of a break. So I'm not sure that Trump, and his supporters are, entirely wrong in this. On the final hand, however, the third hand, I have never seen, as Vera said, an administration that has given us so much material to work with. And, I think that you would be very remiss as a curious journalist not to begin to ask simple questions about things that we have seen. Like, what? Huh? Are you kidding me? You have a man who picks up a telephone and calls what is everybody knows is the most wiretapped house in America, the Russian embassy, tapped, by the Israelis, the Americans, the Chinese, the Norwegians, the British, God only knows. It gets on the phone, has a conversation, and then tells people the conversation didn't take place, knowing that there are transcripts available for this in like every capital in the world. If we did not look into that, something would be very wrong. And so I really don't think, when you sort of net it out, that the coverage is disproportionate or unfair. But I also think, look, I mean, he, constantly screams at all of us. And, you read this, I guess, this Katie Tour book is out where, the Secret Service had to escort her out of some event because he had riled up the crowd to the point where they thought she was in physical danger. As far as I can tell, Katie Tour does very straightforward reporting, but is that in there somewhere? These are people.
But it starts with very basic things like the tax returns. You have someone that ran for president who, unlike the guys in the decades before him, the folks in the decades before him, didn't release his tax returns and made up excuses and lied about why he didn't do that. So when we see that in someone who does that, you say, why doesn't he want to do that? And why is he going to such lengths to do that? And where does our skepticism, where did it begin on him? I don't know, but I think that's a major marker in the story.
And also, correct me if I'm wrong about Whitewater. I was in college, but I vaguely remember the Clinton people complaining they were under some kind of extraordinary scrutiny, the vast right-wing conspiracy, this is unfair, nobody's ever had to put up with this kind of investigation and this kind of journalism.
Yes, I had to reveal last night at our session that, in fact, I was one of the original reporters on the Whitewater land dealings, which dates me in a number of different ways. And yes, it is absolutely true that the Clinton campaign and the Clinton presidency bitterly complained about everything that came out about that, many of which were actually fairly straightforward questions that they refused to answer over and over and over again, to the point where we, as Michael suggests, when you do take out that red flag in front of the bull and say, look, I'm not going to tell you the answers to this, but trust me, it's all fine. Amazingly enough, the bull starts charging at the red flag and says who. And that is our nature. And I will say, and I think everybody in this panel could attest to this, there are many times where you go charging at the red flag, and actually it doesn't turn out to be a big deal. I mean, there are many stories we don't write. But when people tell you in general, it's classified, it's a secret, but if you knew what I knew, you'd know I was perfectly honest, that is not a recipe for getting reporters to go away.
So, Michael, I want to probe a bit on this tax returns, because it is certainly true that Trump refused to release his returns, as was the custom for so long, and he also has refused to divest his vast business holdings, right? But the fact is, there's no law that requires him to do that, right? The president is exempt from conflict of interest laws that govern everybody else. There is no law that requires him to disclose his tax returns. So is it unfair for the media to somehow imply that Trump is doing something wrong by simply spurning the custom, but he's not violating the letter of the law?
Yeah, I think something about what we do in the media is that we're not here to prosecute the law. We're here to bring light to different things, to bring attention to them, to sort of, not right wrongs, but sort of just say, hey, public, here's this issue, here's this thing. Just because it's illegal or legal doesn't mean that we should or shouldn't write about it. Some things that are legal, people think are really, really bad. Some things that are illegal, people think are perfectly fine. So using the legality as the bar for what we cover can be problematic. We ran into this earlier this year when we were looking at this O'Reilly story. We were looking at O'Reilly sexual harassment things, and one of the reporters I was working with said, well, it's not illegal. And we said, well, hold on, just take a step back from this. We're not the prosecutors. We're just trying to bring the facts forward. And I think that's something that plays into a lot of that we can't allow to play into our calculations, legality.
I think it's also to remember that this entire enterprise is built on customs and traditions. And, look, not releasing your tax returns is not going to bring democracy down. But there are a lot of customs and traditions that are not codified in law or regulations that, if were ignored, would potentially threaten how our government works and how our society is structured. And I think that is something that one has to keep in mind when, well, it's not illegal, so it's fine we did this because there was no direct law broken. And that's an excuse is often used by people who've maybe done something wrong but don't want to actually cop to it.
So, Matt, here's kind of a basic question. You only have so many hours in the day. You have so much bandwidth. You still want some time to work out and eat in good restaurants, as we all do. So how do you decide which story you're going to pursue each day? So suppose you come in, tomorrow you're going to go back to work, right? Suppose waiting on your voicemail, there's two really hot tips from what sound like credible sources. One of them is that I've got evidence that when Obama was the president, he was taking bags of cash from Iran. And the other tip is, I've got evidence that Trump last week got a bag of cash. And I know, bags of cash, was the Karzai story for you. So Trump took a bag of cash from Putin. You only have so much time in the day. Which of those stories are you going to go after?
I'm already getting stressed thinking about this right now. I feel like the cortisone in my blood rising. At first, Mike sits right next to me, like, yo, Mike, we got to talk. Look, I think you'd probably, if you had to choose, probably go after the right now one. So it doesn't matter who's in the Oval Office. If they're the one taking the money at the moment, you're probably going to deal with that first. Then again, Obama just left. So, that would be, incredibly hard. I think that on any day, we all have a number of stories running and going. Some, you've been looking at for months. Some you've been looking at for weeks. One just came up that day. And it is like any job, a constant juggle to figure out, okay, how am I going to divide my time, my resources of this? There are stories that are breaking news, so that it just focuses your mind. You got to get it done. You've got a deadline. They need it in an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And then there are stories you think might be competitive that you hear somebody else is working on. So that's the one where you're like, sorry kids, I gotta ignore you this weekend because I gotta get this done. And it is maybe somebody here has a better answer because I've never really succeeded in multitasking so well, and time management isn't my strength.
Well, I'll give you an editor's answer just because, first of all, Vera and I were joking because I said I worked in Washington for a number of years and no one ever really called me with anything very interesting. Okay, maybe once in like 10 years. So I said, maybe I'm just not very likable. But it doesn't really work that way, that you would have these two messages. But now, presuming you would, and so Howard has been a senior editor at a publication, as have I. So if Matt came to me and said, okay, look, boss, I've got these two things, what do I do? I would give the classic editor's answer, which is, we have to write both of them. It's a breath mint and a candy mint. That's my management philosophy. So we would put, he works in an office with 100 people. I'd put 50 people on the Obama tip and 50 people on the Trump tip. And my first question would be, is it competitive? Do we have reason to believe that one of these is, we're going to get beaten by BuzzFeed? And if the answer was no, we'd put half the staff on one thing, half the staff on the other, and try to get both, because we're just greedy as editors. That's the life, right?
And that's a great answer, coming from a man who sits atop a burgeoning news organization and has the resources to do that. So let's take it down to the local level, because there's such a divide between the resources that major national news organizations like you folks represent and the local newspapers that so many Americans still depend on to get a lot of their news. We here in Charlottesville, we have one newspaper that is under incredible economic stress and keeps losing reporters and has nothing much left in its newsroom. And they get a hot tip about some big local story going on right now, and they don't have the resources to put against that. What does that mean for our democracy, that there's this bifurcation happening now where you guys have the resources to go after the big national stories, but the local news that tens of millions of people depend upon is being starved of resources now?
Well, I worked with McClatchy previously, which is a newspaper chain, 30 newspapers across the country, and as most newspaper companies are struggling and losing a lot of resources, especially small newspapers, small cities, in a way was almost encouraged once they decided to take a lot of resources out of things that they always covered, like certain things, certain scores, certain board meetings, and decided to just put them into things that would hold people accountable, things that were breaking news, things that were about, really investigative journalism, and that every time that they did that, they would get a little boom in subscribers. They would, people would talk about those stories, and doing less of when you really don't have resources. I mean, I'm not saying people don't want to read about the baseball game, but putting less resources into covering routine things, like just to fill the paper, the board meetings, certain votes, and putting it into the investigative stories, that would be the last thing to go. And they realized that's what really people were subscribing to. And so that in a way that was kind of encouraging in its own way. But obviously once that goes, I mean, sometimes I get stressed thinking about it. I started at the Miami Herald, just stressed thinking about how much is happening right under our noses when you're a local reporter, and how frustrating it must be to say these people are getting away with everything, and I can't do it. I can't put my time into it. There's not enough people to cover it. And instead, we have oversaturated Washington coverage, and that's just how it goes.
So, Stephen, just on that same, you think about this a lot, obviously, running a major new nonprofit organization, the newspaper revenues in particular, as we all know, have just cratered, right? And in 2006, aggregate newspaper revenues were like $49 billion in ad revenue. And in 2016, 10 years later, they had dropped to $18 billion. So, meanwhile, print newspaper circulation for the kind of middle market and small market newspapers has plunged. So as this media advertising driven business model just continues to completely collapse, forcing all these waves of layoffs and loss of resources, how is the media going to retain its capacity to do its job? Can an organization like yours ever fill the vast voids in coverage that are opening up across the country, these news deserts that are surfacing now?
Well, I think, first of all, I completely agree with what you're saying, and Vera's answer to it, I think, has a little bit of hope, but we have a problem. I mean, one of the Pulitzer Prize winning stories in the last couple of years was an LA Times piece about a town called Bell, California. Bell had no newspaper. It's about an hour's drive from the downtown newsroom of the Los Angeles Times. And the fine city council of Bell and the city manager decided to vote themselves $900,000 a year salaries because nobody was watching. Why not? And then the guy gave himself 56 vacation and sick days a year because, nobody was there. And this only came to light because finally, several years later, some blogger wrote a piece and someone at the LA Times said, well, maybe we should look at this. Seems crazy. Is that really true? And it was really true. So yes, we have a huge problem. And what you're talking about is, number one, the advertising thing is going away and it will continue to fall. All the advertising is ending up in the hands of Facebook and Google and so on. So the newspaper advertising model is dead. What that means is that newspapers have to move, every newspaper, to a subscription model. New York Times now makes more money off subscriptions than ads. And at the local level, that means you've got to create a absolutely imperative reason for people to buy the paper, which isn't a paper anymore. It's probably going to be delivered online because the paper is very expensive. And that means investigative accountability reporting. So it seems to me that has now not become a civic good, it's become a commercial imperative. And if you can do this, you're not going to have the newsroom that I had at the Oregonian when I arrived in 2003. We had 420 employees. Today the Miami Herald, I think, has, what, 200? Today's Oregonian has under 100 editorial employees, 1/4 of what it was. So we're never going back to the 420 days. But the editor at the Oregonian is a very capable investigative editor named Mark Katchis. He is trying to build a reputation for the paper to break stories, find things out, do things that make people want to pay for the paper. I mean, when I worked at the Oregonian, I used to say, could I just have from our readers one latte a week? So you give me $4 or $3, depending on where you buy your coffee, and let me deliver the paper online instead of via the thing, and I can make this work. Now, we in the local news business have not yet gotten to one latte a week. Guy in Philadelphia said one bagel a week, you know. So we haven't even gotten to one bagel. But if we could get there, I think there's hope. And at the moment, you're right. There's a big problem, and the problem is much more at the local level than the national level. So,
Vera, so Trump and his supporters and surrogates routinely target individual reporters and accuse them of bias. Even if this is completely untrue, these allegations of bias can really instill doubt in editors and cause a reporter to pull their punches on future stories. So this seems to have a chilling strategic effect on the accused reporter, doesn't it? Have you been a victim of this, and have you seen evidence among your reporter peers that this is happening, that these accusations of bias are tainting reporters and causing them to pull their punches?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by bias, right? I mean, bias is a kind of, any editor in any of our, if you're actually skewing your coverage, if you are we're not opinion writers, we report the news. And so if you're skewing it, no good editor would ever let you keep doing that, and then we deserve all the criticism we get. But it seems like the new definition of bias is too much scrutiny on something at the expense of something else. Half of my Twitter mentions will be, well, you didn't look at, when I was working at McClatchy, was saying, you didn't look into this with Hillary, or you didn't look at this with Obama, and then I had to give up always tweeting links to our articles from 2012, 2010, to show that we did in fact cover it the same way. But I think to this question of bias and in this scrutiny, I mean, it goes back to what we've all been talking about on how unprecedented some of this is. And so I mean, I'm fairly early in my career, but if we had several other business moguls with foreign connections turned presidents turned people like that who refuse to disclose their tax returns, if we get other people to compare it to, then I think there's a measuring stick. It's like, how grave is this? How important is this? Should we be recovering this as much or this? But once it breaks completely with what's happened in the past, I mean, that's not in our control. That's news. It's news that this is happening. And so I think, of course we're covering that, and of course we're going to keep, when Trump says, tells it, just stay out of my finances, just don't probe that, don't do this. I mean, how are we supposed to not cover that? How are we supposed to not think, what are you hiding? Are you hiding something? And I think that a lot of the current definition of bias among people who criticize journalists and administration is, the president says it's the greatest witch hunt in history to be focusing on this. And I think it's not about skewing your reporting, it's about just the level of scrutiny, which I think is kind of ridiculous.
There's also another type of criticism that I've seen emerging. It's actually come from the left under the Trump era. My guess is there's roots of this and it's been around for a while, but that is giving voice to Trump or to people that support him. The Times ran an op-ed recently by Eric Prince, who is a Trump supporter that was in charge of Blackwater, started Blackwater. And the Times was sharply criticized for simply giving Eric Prince a platform to voice what he was saying. If you do a story in which, Trump spouts off and you repeat what he says and maybe, the reader doesn't think you hold him accountable enough, then we get criticized for that. So there's this thing coming from the left that I've seen where they say, well, by simply giving them a voice, the Times hired Bret Stephens, a conservative op-ed columnist from the Wall Street Journal, was widely criticized for that. There's this thing where if you give voice to it, you're going to get criticized as well.
So, is that scary?
Well, I think we just can't win, right? It's kind of in a way, like, if you're doing a certain, if you're just reporting in a certain way, then we get a lot of criticism. You're saying you're normalizing this. You're normalizing something that is not really normal, which is a certain kind of criticism. And he's saying that we don't provide enough context into how unusual some of this is. And on the other side, again, they're like, why are you focusing there? There's nothing there. Why do you keep going there? And I think, anytime you touch, and most of us, we cover political, investigation. Anytime you touch any of those topics, you're just going to get both. No side's ever really going to be happy with you. And I think the best example is, someone, Mike here, who's, he uncovered the Clinton email server and also broke several stories about Trump. That's what a good investigative journalist does. It's just
right, without an agenda.
Although I do think there's more danger in that idea that by simply reporting on what somebody's saying, that you are somehow spreading their views, that you shouldn't even repeat it because it's so dangerous. There's something very censorious about it, and that will take us down a road where we are often rightly criticized for things we don't cover enough of, for those news judgments. You don't want us in a position where we're saying, well, this important person said it, but we thought it was better to protect America from that. That is a dangerous place for us to get. And it's a dangerous place for people on either the right or left to be saying these views are so terrible nobody should know about them. I think we're all probably for free speech absolutist up here.
Right, but I do think, and this is, there is a kind of question which it will sort of recede over time, but back when there was a front page, that everybody read, as opposed to today where, the vast majority of your readers are online, but still, there is a question. People say, well, don't write about Trump's tweets so much. Well, he's the president of the United States. If he says something about Iran, you have to cover it. But there is a question, and I think we do have to be honest about this. The prominence that we give something, how often we come back to it, those are subjective judgments. Mm-hmm. And I think those who would criticize the email coverage would say, why did you have to keep coming back to it? And those of us who might defend it would say, well, first of all, we never got the whole story until we had to keep coming back to it. So if you'd been more forthcoming, we wouldn't have needed as many stories. And I think there is an argument to be made that in any of these things, I'm sure from Trump's perspective, it was like, look, I had a little locker room banter. Why did you have to keep, writing about that? Hasn't everybody said that sort of thing? And obviously that was not the news judgment of people. And so we did keep coming back to that. But I think what we have to keep, what we choose to come back to, that is subjective. That is something that you can argue about.
And we learn, right? I think a lot of, sometimes the image is that we sit down at the beginning of a year or something and say, this is how we're going to cover these things if they come up. We just adapt. When things happen, we look back and say, we made a mistake here, this could have been a little different. Speaking of the Trump tweets, we at least, I know it used to be huge news whenever he's basically anything, and we've now kind of noticed sometimes that it's not always huge news. Sometimes the president we report it anyway. Of course you're going to report it, but, it just becomes, we put everything in its proper gravity and context, and I think, we're adapting every single day to covering a different environment.
But the other thing is that Trump goes around us when he tweets, because he goes directly to people and they can see it for themselves.
Right.
And that's another thing that we sort of have to contend with here, and this is something that Obama did too, is where they would find ways to just communicate directly with people and to go around us. And that's a dynamic that I think we struggle with, because if he's tweeting it, then why do we need to write it, some people would say. And all of a sudden we just do a story about a tweet.
But part of our job is to add context and nuance, and that's what we should be criticized for. And that's where I disagree on the Prince op-ed. I thought that we let him make a totally self-serving case without any of the context about exactly where he stood on a current attempt to get the administration to hire mercenaries to go fight in Afghanistan, and things that had gone on in Iraq that Blackwater had done, that there needed to be some kind of note with that or something. that said, look, this is what you need to know about Eric Prince to read this intelligently. So we should absolutely be criticized for the context we either do or do not provide. But to say, well, don't cover this, don't let these people speak publicly is something you don't want us to get into.
So let's talk about fake news for a minute. I'm wondering if all of this fake news and the faux outrage really is really just a lot of kabuki theater that doesn't really signify very much. And the reason I ask that is because Trump himself doesn't really appear to mean it, right? I mean, after all, he has courted the media and used it selectively his entire life. The failing New York Times, he's granted the failing New York Times 4 news-making interviews so far, right? That's like, he's talking to you guys. And the media hasn't exactly folded and skulked away in the face of all these accusations. It's actually, as you've all said, this time of investigative revival and these amazing scoop rivalries, right, between all of your news organizations. Surging digital subscriptions, the Trump bump, right? So is this whole thing about fake news really just a giant ratings game that everyone is in on and you're all just playing? Yes or no?
Well, I think the president devotes a fair amount of time to consuming news and to worrying about news. I mean, certainly you can see that in his tweets. And an example of this was in July, we were lucky enough to have we were going to have an interview with the president. And under Obama, if we wanted to interview Obama, we'd have to meet with the White House and try and figure out a date. It would be 6 months down the line because the president doesn't have any time available. And you may get 20 minutes on Air Force One while the plane's landing on some fundraising trip in California. And that would be the one interview for the year. I think we actually only interviewed Obama maybe once or twice, even in the second term. So we're going back and forth with the White House about when we could come. So we're going to come on Wednesday. And I was coming with a colleague of mine, and I said, well, they said, well, come at 11. And I said, well, he's flying back from this thing, whatever. And they said, okay, just come at 1. And his schedule was so open and so, happy to meet with us that it was just come later in the day. Like if hey, do you want to come over for tea? Well, no, just come later. And to me, that told me a lot about the president, just one little thing than I had understood otherwise.
So, Rich Lowry recently observed in Politico, he said, as the media environment has fractured, organizations feel less obligation to try to cultivate a broader audience. And as politics becomes more culturally charged, the divide between the heartland and the coasts, where the media lives and works, becomes even more stark and important. So, does it matter if millions of quote-unquote ordinary Americans no longer trust the work that you all are doing? I mean, one of you said earlier today, those who are inclined to believe conspiracy theories are never really going to be persuaded of what's real and what's not by the New York Times or the Washington Post or ProPublica. The agendas of elite decision makers and power brokers in Washington and New York are still largely driven by what the Times and the Post are reporting. So does it matter if society is dividing into these ever smaller kind of groups of an information elite on one side that still trusts media and everybody else? Is that really a problem? Because really the power still is working in the same way that it always has.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I would accept, as I suspect you would have anticipated, the premise of the question, which is that the fact that the world of readers is fracturing is of no concern to us. I don't know about you guys, but it's certainly post-election, every conversation I had with a journalist, either in my organization or elsewhere, was about this as a threat to democracy and about the importance of trying to reach people with verifiable facts, which, thanks to the internet, we can do. I mean, we put up, at this point, when we put up a story, we can put up the documents and the data and the material and the interviews, and we can really help people see where we're coming from and why we think what we think. So, I mean, I think this is the obsessive conversation of everyone in the media, And my belief is, on the one hand, you can't change conspiracy-minded people. I mean, if you really truly think Alex Jones is right about everything and that the massacre in Connecticut was staged by, the Obama administration and those parents of the dead children are actors, if all those things you really believe in, you're never going to, fine. I'm probably not going to reach that group. But there is a large, what I would call convincible middle in America who I believe we can and should be trying to reach. And I think they can be reached. And I think, the evidence on the healthcare bill, as we just talked about earlier, suggests that people do read things. So no, I don't. Quite the contrary. I don't agree with that.
Michael, this is a question for you, I think. Lately, this pace of dueling exclusives between the Post and the Times in particular, it seems to have died down. In the spring, every night I would pick up my smartphone at 10 o'clock before I went to sleep, and there would be an exclusive from both sides, right? Something. That's not happening right now. So, should we be concerned about that? Are there some more big shoes that are about to be dropped?
Thank God.
We need to sleep sometimes.
Yeah.
The pace of this story is very unusual and very intense, and it was particularly significant in those first few months of the administration. It has not really dropped off. It has come down a bit and sort of plateaued. I think that people want to have a lot of clarity. They want stories that break this thing open and completely explain them and sort of provide them with a finished product of what really happened. And we're a year into an FBI investigation into links between Trump and Russia. We're 7 months into his presidency, and we don't have that clarity yet. For someone like myself who didn't live through Watergate, Watergate comes to me as a finished product. You learn about it in school. There was this president, the media, tried to hold him accountable. He ended up resigning. Here it is. Here's Watergate. But if you're Bob Woodward living through Watergate and you're 7 months into it, Bob Woodward didn't know where that story was going at that point. And I understand that the public would like that clarity, but it's going to take a lot more time to really understand the Russia story and everything. And there may very likely not be much here. There may be an enormous amount of smoke that leads Democrats to be ultimately skeptical of Trump, but there never may be anything that really definitively defines this. And I think that's something that the public has to start to understand, is that this may not be a black and white answer in the end that says, Trump X, Y, from Russia. And that's something that we struggle with.
Absolutely. I also think that pace where every night you're getting new revelations, it gets confusing for people, frankly. I mean, we did a chart trying to explain all the connections between various Trump actors and Russia, and thank God we did that, because I think I needed it to understand a few of them, and I've been writing about these guys. that there's a point where the slowdown is good because it gives everybody a chance to step back, do some longer term kind of reporting and thinking, but also to reassess and realize that, another story about another meeting of two kind of secondary or tertiary characters is probably not helpful at this point. If that's news, it should be somewhere in the newspaper, but you need to find a way to contextualize that and explain that to readers. I also think one of the other things, the reason you've seen a slowdown is because it was July and August in Washington. You had some healthcare stuff wrapping up in July. August, everybody went away. And a lot of the kind of characters and actors that drive news just went away, and they're back now, and you'll probably see a picking up of the pace in the next few months.
Yeah, probably the Red Sox weren't so happy about that slowdown, but other than that...
Which, by the way, if we're part of the resistance, that's the right resistance, the anti-Red Sox resistance to be on,
Right, but also a lot of it, it's assuming, in the question that, that we are just working in a vacuum where we create the pace, and then, we are just pushing this out, whereas when you think about it, like you said, the first couple of months were very intense, and then the president fired the FBI director, and that created a huge wave of more stories, and some of these are not self-inflicted, but these are driven sometimes by actions of we are not necessarily always in control of the pace of that, because something like that will happen, a new investigation will happen. A lot of us will, when they break a story, sometimes we will say, oh, that makes sense of some of my reporting, and I've kind of seen it come in waves that are not really of our own making all the time.
So let's take some questions. Stuart, are you here with the microphone? So if you all have a question, just raise your hand, and Stuart will bring the microphone over to you.
Thanks. Is it on? Yes. I just inject this question in a spirit of levity, not serious. Do any of you up front know if Jimmy Carter ever got his peanut farm back?
That's a good question.
I think they made him divest himself of
They
it.
did, yes.
Yeah. Did he get it back, ever?
I don't know.
I think Trump bought it, actually.
It's a great question.
There's the story.
Look that up after.
Yes, this gets to the deluge of information with the bringing on of Kelly to sort of organize and whatever. And given that Obama had things screwed down pretty tight, and now Kelly's trying to do some of that, what's your anticipation, or have you seen even anything come of that? Or are there still disillusioned people that are still talking?
I think that Kelly has changed a fair amount of things and tried to bring in some structure. I think the media maybe has followed that narrative sort of out the window a little bit, that the general comes in and presents order. At the end of the day, Donald Trump is a 71-year-old man who has shown an unwillingness to change based on a significant amount of negative press and disclosures that would have sent a lot of politicians home. So the idea that 7 months into his administration, a guy's going to walk in the door and completely transform the way that this man who had the Access Hollywood tape and went on to become elected president is going to change fundamentally, I think is a far-fetched thought. Can Kelly get the different factions of the White House to work better and to sort of streamline those processes? Probably. Kelly is an incredibly capable guy. He ran Southern Command. He ran the entire military for South America, Central America. Could he do that? Yes. At the end of the day, if Donald Trump thinks that Kelly is boxing him in or restricting his access, then Kelly will find himself in the graveyard that a bunch of other folks in Trump world have found themselves.
But has it reduced your access to people talking to you?
I think it has, in a sense that, especially on the national security, on the intelligence side, on the law enforcement side, most of the people in these roles believe in institutions and authority. They look at somebody like General Kelly, they say, well, that's somebody, we know him, people like him. We're going to give him a chance. And so you get a kind of bump or a moment in the weeks after his appointment where maybe they back off a little bit and say, well, maybe he's going to fix things. And we want things to get fixed on the inside the right way. And if he succeeds, then yeah, it probably will limit some access to us in some sources. If he doesn't succeed, they will come back to us, people we've dealt with for years, people we know, because they'll think, okay, well, we need the press, we are the last resort. When things are not working, let's expose it publicly. And that Kelly will give confidence to some people for some time to see if he can get his job done.
Do you find the motivation of people who are talking to you and leaking to you, is it different now than in the past? Is there some nobility to it now, where in the past it might have been for kind of craven political advantage?
Well, I think there's a difference between kind of the political game, people who cover politics and those leaks, where you're trying to score points over somebody else, and in the kind of more policy, national security world, where, especially when you're dealing with classified information, where I think we've always had people who see something wrong, they can't get it fixed on the inside, so they come to us to expose it. I think you see a lot more of that right now because you're seeing a lot more they think is wrong. They think is not going right. They're doing it in good faith, almost all of them. I think when you get up to there is a level of inside this administration of pure political backbiting where that is not good faith. That is kind of real, kind of mafioso kind of level backbiting.
But you did have the largest disclosure of classified information in 2013 under Obama, when Edward Snowden walked out of the government with 1 million pages of documents. So while we can sit here and say, yes, people appear more politically motivated, maybe there are more people that are willing to do it, at the same time, it was the most devastating disclosure in American history happened 5 years into Obama's presidency.
Thank you. So this was really one of the craziest political seasons we've ever had. And I am a mother of 2 children/young adults. My daughter, 19, voted for her the first time and was a hardcore Bernie supporter. My son, 16, pronounced during this election time that he was a conservative, and made for very interesting conversations around the dinner table. He went so far as wanting to start the very first Young Conservatives group at our local high school. He is not pro-Trump. We did define that, but anyway, it caused us all these different conversations talking about fake news and so forth, that I made a deal with him because he wanted to start the Young Conservatives group, because he said that both sides were not being presented fairly at his high school. And so he made me promise I would start watching Fox News, and I made him watch other channels with me, CNN and others. And anyway, it came to light this past August 12th with all that was coming to a head here in Charlottesville. We watched the coverage of what was happening in our town on various channels. And it was very enlightening to see the different points of view. My question to you is, this generation, those that will be voting in the next election, just voted, perhaps very disheartened from it all. What are your suggestions to a mother to talk to them, or if you ever have a chance to talk to these generations, how do they move forward and not think that this crazy that we're living in right now is the new normal?
All right, well, as the father of a 25, 21, and 16-year-old, I guess we have had these conversations at home, and I mean, I think all you can say to people is that engagement is better than non-engagement. There are ways to engage in the political process, that if you have beliefs about things, there are ways to express your either agreement or protest. Thankfully, my kids haven't been arrested yet, and I have to say, it's a little bit scary. I mean, the day after Charlottesville, one of my kids was going to an anti-Trump thing at Trump Towers, and the older one, and I said to her, look, of course you should go. I understand why you're going, but be aware of what's around you. I said, keep your eye on the street. That's a strange thing for a parent to say, right? But I don't know what else you do say at this point in history. So, you do feel a little bit sad that the children that we're talking about grew up in the shadow of 9/11 and now all of this. I was a foreign correspondent in Central Europe in 1990, and the wall had come down. South Africa, Mandela was president. Northern Ireland was getting settled. A couple of years later, we had the Oslo Agreement. And, for a very brief moment there, I thought we were going to hand our kids a somewhat better world. I'm not sure we're quite pulling that one off. So, but if there's anything we know about history, is that it radically changes. And, there are people who are saying this period right now we're seeing is the end of times. There are also other people saying it's the Carter administration, and out of this period of history will come a very different kind of American politics. I don't think we know, and I think all you can say is be engaged and stand up for what you believe in.
I'm just curious, for you on the panel, and for my own, I know the Times, of course, would be viewed as a more leftward-leaning publication. But are any of you on a conservative outlet or work for a conservative outlet on this panel? I take that as a no.
No, I think as folks from the Times, I would take the description of the Times as a liberal publication is something that a lot of people say. When I tell people I wrote the Hillary Clinton email story, that can sometimes rattle people because they're like, well, that's what the New York Times wrote. So as reporters on this story, we're out there following the facts regardless. And as I was explained before, that's a hard thing for people to sometimes get their head around. But the editorials and the op-eds in the Times tend to be more liberal. But that's a different side of the house from what we're working on.
Okay. You being from the Times, could I follow up with an incident here in Charlottesville? And the report was that the New York Times reporter, when she presented her account to the Times, her editor directed her to remove any references to there being members of the Antifa present at that. Why would an organization like yours do such a thing? You talk about facts and presenting the facts. Why would an editor obviously remove facts?
So I'm fairly certain that didn't happen, actually.
Oh, it did.
Oh, well, this is one of those great moments. I would encourage you after this to send all of us what the evidence is of that. As a former New York Times editor, I can tell you that I find what you just said to be implausible, but I'd like to be proven right. I will tell you that weekend I was the editor on duty at ProPublica when our reporter, A.C. Thompson, was here. And not only did we not do that, but I insisted, it was my request, because he had just been gassed and seen and was very upset and had been up for 48 hours. And I said, AC, were any of those guys with the black masks and the whatever they call them, Antifa, whatever the hell they are, were they there? And he says, yeah, they were here. And I said, we need to report that. So if you go look up our story, not only is it there, but it was there at the insistence of an editor who used to work at the New York Times. And I find hard to believe that anybody who was in that job that I used to be in would have said anything different. But let's see the proof.
Well, let's move on in terms of this subject. My concern
I know,
is...
but I'd like to see the proof. I'm serious. Because
Yeah.
if you're right, then I think it's a heck of a story, which none of us are aware of. But if you're wrong, with all respect, then it's not true.
I can, but it was very clear what I read anyways.
Please do share it.
The bigger issue, though, is the founder of this university mentioned the health of a democracy is dependent on an informed and educated public. And sadly, the American people are not stupid. And right now, the approval ratings for the media are in the single digits. I'm reminded of Aristotle saying the beginning of all wisdom begins with knowing oneself. Has there been any review in which the media has looked at itself in terms of what are we doing? Because I see you doing, just like we witnessed Hillary, blaming everybody else, but not looking at herself. In an analogous way, in this presentation, I see you doing the same. What have you done to reestablish your perception in the eyes of the American public? Because it's in the toilet.
His facts are wrong.
I'll try and... First of all, I want to push back on the idea that there is conservative, liberal media when it comes to the reporters. Look, I worked at the Wall Street Journal for years. The editorial page of the Wall Street Journal has been kind of a leading voice of the American right for decades. I think you will find there are a lot of Times reporters who worked at the Journal and vice versa. There's a lot of interplay that on the news side, we really do try and report without fear or favor, to try and be fair and as balanced as one can be. The approval rating is not in the single digits. I also think you're wrong about that. There's a dearth of polling data that indicates it's at varying stages. It's actually gone up recently.
Let's put it this way: your approval ratings were far lower than President Trump's.
I don't think that's true.
That's actually not the case.
It's actually incredible. We'll have it in 1 sec.
And I think, look, I've sat in any number of meetings, of lunches, of conversations since the election, before the election, about what we're doing wrong, what we missed, what we didn't get, what we did do right. And I think there's a constant level of introspection there. Look, I do think there is an issue where the media is largely based in big cities. And not everybody is from big cities, but they've all relocated there, working there. So you tend to reflect the kind of values or the worldview of urban America. And there are blind spots there. You look at some of our softer coverage, our sports and cultural coverage. Look at our sports section. It's a great example. We have a really interesting sports section. And a lot of these things, are kind of featurey beats. We don't cover NASCAR. You don't cover anything with hunting. And, there are a great many Americans who are NASCAR fans who do hunt. And I think that's a real hole. And you can see that up and down in those parts of the paper. I think you're absolutely right. But in terms of, we're out there to kind of make one point, either a left-wing point or a right-wing point, it just isn't there. You're not going to find it. Look, we're imperfect people. Everybody is fallible. And so you're trying your best. You're not always succeeding.
Do you recall the Harvard University study in terms of coverage of this election? You know what I'm referring to?
I don't, actually.
In terms of the coverage being balanced, and they listed which outlets were percentage-wise, the stories were either negative or positive.
I don't.
That was generated by Harvard University, but you're not aware of that?
I'm not aware of that, but this sort of presents for us, and this is an interesting illustration of it, the criticisms that we get on both sides. Hillary Clinton's out there today pushing a book in which she's criticizing the New York Times for being too tough on her. You believe that our coverage wasn't tough enough and was too tough on Trump. And
I believe it wasn't balanced.
Okay, wasn't.
Balance is what I'm looking for, and I think the American public, if I can give you some feedback, is looking for balance. And that's where the media, I go back to Huntley Brinkley and Walter Cronkite. There was a relating of the facts, and it was left to the American people to then interpret how they felt about it. But there's been an insidious, I would call it, entrance of like I mentioned, the New York Times incident of skewing the facts in a certain way, to the point where that's reflected in the poor favorability ratings of the media. And I don't understand why. I've never heard any objective analysis done by the media, and certainly I would think the Miller Center here would do something like that. Where it would give again a balanced view of the media, because this country needs a good media.
Why doesn't it count as balanced to you that this one man, Michael Schmidt, wrote the seminal story about Hillary Clinton that arguably led to things that cost her the election on one side, and on the other side now he's doing stories about alleged wrongdoing in the Trump administration? Why isn't that balanced to you?
Howard, I'd go back to your panel. Where is there a conservative-based outlet on your panel?
But the issue...
It is the point.
Right.
Pardon? Pardon?
They're not supposed to be conservative or liberal. They're supposed to report the facts.
And
okay,
that's what I'm pointing out. The American people realize that the outlets from what they're composed are not reporting the facts.
all right. But it is fair. It is fair to say let's take another question. Yeah.
events that come along.
There's the microphone.
How do you people get your information, other than heavily having people come and leak to you? I mean, you must follow each and every one of you, or have friends that you speak to constantly. So what is the process that you use to sort out what's kind of crazy, what's reasonably sane, and what will sell, which has got to be part of yours, because journalism is having a hard time in the time of this tectonic, as one Jindal put it, the tectonic plates are shifting because of the internet, because we are going tech, because the middle of the country doesn't have as much information as we do because they don't have the towers, and etc. Anybody? What do you do in the morning? Do you get up and read the Guardian and the Times and the Post and see who wrote what, or does somebody tell you, or?
Well, we were having a we were having a conversation a little bit about this last night. We were talking about how sometimes we are all in our own little bubbles on what we cover. You have a bit of a broader view, but sometimes we just, a lot of the time we try to take ourselves completely out of what we cover, because otherwise you just spend all your time reading. I cover national security right now, just national security news all day, and then read something completely unrelated, something that's still really important investigative journalism. You were saying that's what you do. Sometimes you just go in and try to find one big interesting story that was done about something unrelated. Related to what you're saying, I think we try to balance it out, because when you're a beat reporter, it's easy to just be sucked into, when you do that, you read everything you can find from all outlets, from anybody who has news to share, anybody who has new information. It doesn't matter if it's a blog or if it's New York Times, anybody who has something new that advances the story, you're going to read. That's what I do.
There's a whole bunch of various sort of aggregation of newsletters that come out that you can get for email for free, and you can literally spend hours clicking on all the various links. But there now is an industry in Washington. The Washington Post does one, the New York Times has one. Politico has one. The people who left Politico have one, who used to do it for Politico and now do it, and then they're actually different, and you got to read them both. NBC has one. It goes on and on. You kind of flip through. Anything that's interesting on any side of the political spectrum is going to be somewhere in one of those things. And I have a 50-minute train ride every day in the morning, and I'm basically clicking through that. I did want to come back to two things the gentleman said back there that I think are important. Michael said it. I will say it out loud. We are not politically aligned. ProPublica does not have an editorial page, so I don't even have to go through this. Our op-eds, our editorials. We get up in the morning, we try to report it straight, we try to show you, the reader, where the information comes from, and we would love to have, and we do have right now, a bigger, broader readership than we've ever had, and I'd like to have 10 times as much, and I'd like to have it be even more distributed in parts of the country that are quote-unquote not on the coast. Although I will tell you, from our analytics, we can see where people are when they're reading, and surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly, it's actually very evenly distributed. It is not like a band on each coast. It goes all the way across the country. And to come back to the question about reporting facts, I'm serious. I'm on Twitter. I challenge you to send me, and I will share with everybody, the link where you can show that a New York Times reporter said, delete from the Charlottesville story all references to violence on the left. You show me that, and I will put it on my Twitter feed. Put up.
Are you aware that armed left counter-protesters arrived?
That's not the question. You made a specific charge which denigrates the reputation of what I believe to be a fine journalism outfit.
My first plan was to, after this is over, to come up and ask you for your email address, and I will send that. Stephen.engelberg@propublica.org. If you forget that, it's on the website with my office phone number. I get lots of phone calls from people with tinfoil on their head, along with a lot of other people. So I'm very public. You just Google my name and ProPublica. I'm right there in the staff list, #1 editor-in-chief. Let's not get off the subject. You made a factual allegation. Put up. If it's true, let's have it.
Take one more. We'll take one more question.
Matt made a point earlier about there being sort of a division between the business reporters and the political reporters. And my point of curiosity is where the investigation into the past of the Trump organization, particularly their financing following the bankruptcies, the casino bankruptcies, when all of a sudden apparently a lot of Russian oligarch money flowed in, had to be money laundered, and a lot of it went through the Trump organization. At least that's an impression that us semi-informed yahoos here in the backwaters of the country have formed. Is there more work being done to pull those strings together? I mean, I'm sure there are people who do a lot of reporting on real estate who have then very little connection, very little input on the political side, and it probably hasn't been a fancy topic for the political reporters to cover, except for the comment that was it Eric let loose to a golf reporter that, yeah, we're getting lots of, we don't need any money from the New York banks anymore. We're getting lots of money from the Russians.
They have. I think what I was referring to was at the outset of this presidency. You had this situation where, you had somebody with a long history in a variety of businesses, entertainment and show business, casinos, real estate. Whereas, when normally you have a president who comes in after years in public service. So when Whitewater began, you were down there with some guys from Washington investigating. Here, you have a kind of broader thing. So it was getting kind of people into place and getting editors and management structures in place to kind of harness those resources that existed inside the paper. But there are a lot of internal, semi-artificial divisions, some of them with very good reason and set up to kind of help gear coverage towards one thing or the other, and kind of getting, basically getting all those resources marshaled and focused and working together is like any big bureaucracy, it just takes time. It takes time and effort.
On the finance side, I think that some of financial reporting is some of the hardest reporting for reporters to do. It's a little bit easier if the company's public. It's much more difficult if the company's private. Mr. Trump's companies are private, which gives us very little access to it. And there's certain areas where we can take the ball only so far, and where a guy like Bob Mueller, who has guys with badges and guns and the power of subpoena, can get to documents and get to things and unravel them in ways that we can't. I'm not saying that we have taken the finance story as far as we can go, but we don't have all the tools to unravel it in a way that I think we wish we could. And it's been a very frustrating story. A lot of Trump finance stories read like, hey, there's this thing, it looks kind of weird, we can't explain it, go figure it out yourself. And that's unsatisfying to the reader. And I get it. But we can only go so far at different times.
Yesterday, I think you made a point about Panama, that you were involved with some of the Panama Papers. There has to be some connection there, too.
Well, that particular law firm that released the leak wasn't really where a lot of Americans kept their offshore accounts. So, there was this it was a huge news globally. In a lot of countries, a lot of very high up people were implicated. But I think in the US, it kind of fell flat for a lot of people who were hoping there was this giant revelation tied to Trump or to Hillary Clinton. But there's, like I said yesterday, there was his name is mentioned over 3,000 times in it, but that's because he runs a giant sprawling empire and business empire where he leases his name in a way people pay him to put his name on their buildings across the world. And a lot of we sorted through all those 3,000, each single one we kept them down, and just trying to see if it helps. But what that leak actually does for a lot of stories that have been coming out the last couple of months, my colleagues at McClatchy who are still covering this very closely, is every time there's a new connection. I mean, Manafort was in there a lot, the former campaign manager. A lot of people, every time they come out, we run them through the database, and it's not always news, but it really helps us in a way that in the world of financial reporting, which often is very close for a lot of these companies, it's just really helpful for us because it helps us map out sometimes how the wealthy put their money offshore and who's connected to who. And even though in these cases often it doesn't lead to news, that particular financial leak, I mean, was very helpful for just in illustrating how a lot of this works for a lot of reporters.
I guess what we need is the Deutsche Bank papers. That would,
there we go.
That would be good.
Yeah. Anyway, please join me in thanking the panel, and thank you all.